On truth-telling. A demonstration of the inseparability of truth from the telling of it. By Michael E. Hunter. 60C. Appendix. Honor and integrity in philosophy. Are they possible? Honor and integrity in philosophy, are they possible? Is this a proper question? And it might already be asked, is this a serious question? I was thinking it might not be. I was thinking it was improper but not in any conventional sense. I was thinking rather that it was out of focus or imprecise. Not that I am saying now that this is not the case or, for that matter, that the question is not improper. But what I'm saying, what I came to realize, is that, in a certain sense, the question is proper for all the reasons which seem to weigh against it. But this will take some explaining, and it is best to start with the objection which is most likely to be raised against it before all others, that it takes on too much. How can such a question, already admitted to be faulty and uncertain, take on the honor and integrity of philosophy? For if it is seriously asked, are honor and integrity in philosophy possible? Then does it not become impossible to take this question itself seriously? Oh, but perhaps this is not serious enough. Perhaps it is necessary to say that, if this question is meant to raise a suspicion and make it possible to doubt the very possibility of honor and integrity in philosophy, then it is not only guilty of taking on too much, but of being foolish, wasteful, and certainly at odds with its presumed subject. I admit there is something to this objection which has to do with my initial worry about the questions being out of focus or imprecise. At least, I admit this is the case insofar as the objection of taking on too much is abandoned and gives way entirely to the objection of not having a serious question. For contrary to what might be expected, the question takes on what it should take on, and I would like to demonstrate this. On the other hand, I must admit that, from the strictest but not necessarily the most serious point of view, the question lacks a certain seriousness or rigor. It was never my intention to call into question the very possibility of honor and integrity in philosophy, but only to look into the nature of this possibility. So in this way the question's being imprecise or out of focus is equivalent to its being, at the most serious or rigorous level, a bit of a feint or an amusement. But does this feint or amusement still not detract from an overall honor and integrity, an overall seriousness which, to come closer to the meaning of this equivocal word as it is now being used, is both the respectability and responsibility of philosophy, and which, even if I am now calling it in question, is nonetheless proper to it? On the basis of a certain amount of goodwill on the part of the reader, I think the answer will be no, if I can perfectly justify this feint or amusement and promise that Northwest Other will take place with or without an accompanying acknowledgement which, as it seems, is meant to justify or at least partially justify it. In spite of such a kindly response and tolerant attitude, I well understand the expectation if not the demand which must attend it, namely, that after having justified or having tried to justify the initial proceedings and their waywardness, I should carry on in an orderly fashion and lay one proposition after another. I well understand this expectation, and yet I am not sure it can be justified, or at least that it can be justified any better than the way I'm proceeding and, for that matter, will continue to proceed. After all, if what is being addressed here is honor and integrity in philosophy and, more precisely, their possibility, then surely this matter involves at least some practical concerns which never quite make it into theory, and therefore at least some elements which escape the straight and narrow. To speak properly about this subject then is to speak about it as comprehensively as possible and to risk some infelicities in order to all the better catch sight of them. For it should not be decided beforehand that these infelicities have nothing to do with the honor and integrity of philosophy, honor and integrity in philosophy, as these, and it is difficult to say what they are at this point, but let us now call them foundational or highest principles, come to be assumed or asserted. Of course, the prevailing point of view is that these principles, foundational or otherwise, are installed in philosophy not as possibility but as necessity. Philosophy would not be philosophy without them, so the thinking goes, it would not be possible without their being necessary. From the prevailing point of view then, there is no issue here, or at least none which is of central importance to philosophy. From the prevailing point of view, to be as comprehensive as possible is still to stop short of considering infelicities to be essential, rather than accidental, to philosophy. Where is the legitimacy then of my own point of view which goes in the opposite direction? To begin answering this question, I will say that part of my understanding of what it is to be as comprehensive as possible is to look at the meaning of this particular expression. It seems to be wholly at odds with what I'm doing as an admittedly brief and faulty exercise, and yet it equally seems to be very much its essence. Is it possible there are two ways of being as comprehensive as possible in philosophy? Two senses of this expression which are co-founded, necessarily asymmetric, and eternally irreconcilable. I think these two senses can be spotted if one thinks of philosophies being able to examine all subjects only on the basis of skipping at least one which is essentially itself and, on the other hand, philosophies or at least something like philosophies taking exception even to this essential or basic exclusion. But it is necessary to go slowly here because it is precisely the notion of two senses of philosophical comprehensiveness which will be contested in one way or another, and not necessarily wrongly or at least not necessarily so in the most comprehensive sense, in the name of the honor and integrity of philosophy. This contestation will of course come from the prevailing point of view and the thinking that philosophical comprehensiveness has only one sense and that two senses of it must be, if taken as philosophy's essence or overall way of being, nonsensical. I am certainly in no position to raise an objection to this major objection to nonsense except to say that the status of the nonsensical at the very heart of the honor and integrity of philosophy has yet to be determined. But, then again, it will be quickly added that this is already assuming too much or rather not assuming enough and that the heart of philosophy must be deemed pure, necessarily pure, in advance. But how pure? How necessarily pure? Certainly reasons and arguments have been handed down throughout the ages that the heart of philosophy is necessarily pure reason, but never conclusively and only continually or consensually, and in the most general or imperfect way. Certainly there is much here that speaks of strength and will and desire and authority, but, even according to the proponents of pure reason, even according to their standards, strength and will and desire and authority are themselves not sufficient. Does a long history then of insufficient authority and inconclusive arguments add up to pure reason? It must be so, but then only by force of conviction, by a judgment or ruling which has numbers on its side in order to be, as opposed to a more intractable and marginal way of thinking, true, appropriate, correct, legitimate, proper, right, adequate, and so on. But why this force of conviction and superiority of numbers if not for a fact which, naturally enough, will not be recognized by a great many except in a generous moment and a certain taking in and tolerating of what must be, naturally enough, contested by them? Why this force of conviction and superiority of numbers, to say it again, if not for a fact which is complicated and yet which I insist on calling a fact for the reason that it is empirical and social and yet not separable from another fact which is less of a fact and which belongs to the still to be determined heart of philosophy? Why this force of conviction and superiority of numbers, to say it a third time, if not for the fact that the prevailing view of philosophy, what bears most generally on what it is to comprehend philosophically and to be philosophically comprehensive, is effectively the basis or at least what seems to be the most solid basis of not only itself, the prevailing point of view and all its manifestations, but any other point of view. Now it is necessary to go slowly here and, as a cautionary note, say that perhaps many of those who, a moment ago, I said would not recognize the above fact except in a generous moment are even now contesting this assessment because they see no essential problem in recognizing it. But, if so, they are only concentrating on one end of this fact and thinking that all I'm saying here is that the condition of the possibility of a certain philosophical abnormalcy or impropriety is a much more certain philosophical normalcy. Indeed, this is being said, but it is also being said or at least implied that it works the other way and that the condition of the possibility of philosophy's wholeness, normalcy, and, just as elastic a notion as these, its honor and integrity, are all its extraordinary, abnormal, improper, objectionable, inside and outside comings and goings, its disarrangements which can only be, according to the prevailing point of view, its internal and voluntary rearrangements. If, as I suspect, there is some consternation and perplexity now which does not amount to open and violent disagreement, this is but the fleeting symptom of what always registers itself, to speak most broadly, on two intimate but antagonistic levels, the level of the philosophical comprehension and comprehensiveness which doubles back on itself, overlooks itself, and checks itself, with two possible meanings here, and the level of philosophical comprehension and comprehensiveness which, seeing no proper repair or respite or, to speak more positively, use for itself at this first level, retreats from it and redeems itself, that is, its own proper level, by denying what always seems to be the self-denial of the first level. And if I say now that it is wrong to think that all is confused and unclear here, but that all that is confused and unclear about these levels including, of course, their respective bids for clarity and order is the very spirit of philosophy, then do I not say something which, although or rather precisely because it is an affirmation coming from the first level, sounds every bit like a negation from the second, that is, sounds like a denial of philosophy to those who work and thrive on the second level? Personally, I see no resolution to this situation but only resolutions which, one way or another, constitute the honor and integrity of philosophy. But, of course, one of these resolutions is not just one among many, but the resolution of philosophy which identifies it with itself, with something settled, resolved, out of the way, no longer in question, and no longer in need of being questioned. All of this, to be sure, marks a healthy, active, and onward-going spirit without which philosophy would be entrapped in itself and not be able to go outside itself and into the world. Who would deny it? Who would deny it except perhaps the other part of philosophy, but is this really a denial? Which doubles back on itself and finds a certain lack, a certain anomaly, a certain untruth precisely where philosophy proper has mandated its search for truth. Perhaps, if assurances are no longer quite what they were, the question, honor and integrity in philosophy, are they possible? Is a little closer and more serious now. And yet I do not think, on the basis of how I must immediately qualify this proposal, I will subvert or undercut what I am suggesting about others coming a little closer to my way of thinking. I mean, when I say, as I must now, that this coming a little closer to the question and taking it more seriously is wholly dependent on the generous moment of these others, the many who, as I mentioned earlier, take in and tolerate to a certain degree the point of view which must be ultimately contested by them. I of course affirm here a gap between them and me which can never be closed but which does not rule out a partial closing or coming closer. A gap which, if I may say so and, indeed, I must say so, is a certain lack of honor and integrity which exists on both sides and yet which each side must think exists more on the other side or else it wouldn't be truly upholding its point of view. It is the generous moment of the many which empowers me to say this right now and grants me a certain latitude, as I am well aware, as long as I don't abuse it. And yet I must abuse it or else what I think about honor and integrity in philosophy or, more precisely, what I think about the lack of them, would end up as a feint in the direction of an objectivity, an immaculate conception of honor and integrity, which is precisely the kind of philosophical comprehension and comprehensiveness I am not after. The kind of philosophical comprehension and comprehensiveness I am after admits that it is inescapably a part one pre and that, despite this, it still strives for a kind of immaculate conception. But in order to avoid being a feint in this direction, in order to avoid doing what the other side habitually does and act as if it already possessed a core of pure objectivity, a nugget of crystal transparency, it must worry itself about being, as much but no more than the other side, a part one pre. As much but no more than the other side. I just said that out of courtesy or even a tactical move and now I am forced to backtrack and admit that I consider the prevailing point of view to be the larger and more deep-rooted prejudice. What does the implicit but the always strongly felt appeal to numbers and duration mean to me if there is never a single argument which can conclusively prove me wrong? And yet, because I admit that my own point of view is a part one pre, I gain no major advantage or victory here except the right to affirm this point of view, to voice it abroad, to influence a few others who might be with me more than they know. And if it were asked, to what end goes all this marginal maneuvering and influencing of a philosophical or half-philosophical nature, I would reply that, despite all the faultiness of myself, my endeavor, and everything attached to it, its end can only be the honor and integrity of philosophy and, more precisely, to make up for, at least in part, the lack of honor and integrity in philosophy. We should all be grateful for this lack, even though we usually are not, even though, in a sense, it would be unnatural to be grateful for it allows us to have whatever we have of honor and integrity. This lack, to say it again, is the gap between the two sides, between the two points of view, between the two levels of philosophical comprehension and comprehensiveness which never can be closed or filled up but, in the very attempt to do so by either one side of the other or both sides at the same time but not with, by any means, the same sort of success, becomes effectively the womb of whatever can be called right or wrong, rightly or wrongly, weakly or strongly. A certain order even at the very heart of order which can only be at the very heart of philosophy is never quite right, never quite wrong but never quite right, and this is perhaps the most courteous but least courageous way to describe the lack of honor and integrity in philosophy. I am putting it this way, I am couching it in these terms of courtesy and courage which I oppose here but which of course can be complementary in other contexts because, 1, they are at least representative to some degree of what is at stake here and because, 2, order even in philosophy can go beyond having more than a little wrong with it and with nothing being said about it. But how can all this of a seemingly wider scope and hinting at the complex relationship between the individual and the polite but policing institution be determined as something not simply accidental to philosophy but as essential to it? With the objective of answering this question, I have held off on an examination of the terms honor and integrity in order to allow them to appear here with whatever infelicities cannot be avoided. Now it is time to look at these terms but I wish to do so with some further questions. What happens when, instead of making the usual move of prescribing such and such definition, one takes into consideration the range of already alive and active ones? What is revealed about the honor of philosophy when it principally attaches itself, and this is certainly a way of defining itself, to its good name and reputation, its illustrious past, its declared calling, its many contributions which are of course presumed to be among the best and highest? What is revealed about this form of philosophy's honor if one compares it to something else of a definitional character, which is of course the content of philosophy's honor, that is, its commitment to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I would say that a division reveals itself, for if to tell the truth means to reveal whatever is bad along with whatever is good, and if, furthermore, it is not right for philosophy simply to assume its own goodness, then its truth-telling commitment is essentially and not accidentally at odds with its promoting itself as the good. For even if the truth-telling commitment and the self-promotion of philosophy tend to overlap a good deal, it is still the independence of the first from the second which ultimately keeps philosophy honest, or at least more honest than it otherwise would be. The form and content of philosophy's honor are essentially at odds, and sometimes they are greatly at odds, but this does not mean that one is ever in a position to overpower or stalemate the other. Indeed, it is difficult to know what such an overpowering of form by content or content by form could possibly mean, for the division between them is never complete, and so is also, in a manner of speaking, their undividedness. For just as they are never each other at any particular moment, so they are each other, or southwest they become very close to each other and cross each other's path, at many moments. After all, the truth-telling of philosophy, which is the questioning of its own good name, has no value unless it is somehow anchored in the good which is hardly distinguishable from this good name. And, similarly, the good name of philosophy has no value unless it is somehow anchored in the truth which is principally about itself. Now, with respect to the word integrity, it is often coupled to the word honor in order to evoke the highest moral or ethical standards. But what is the significance of this gesture, this coupling, when it is done, as is the case here and now, in relation to the very tradition, the very institution which, if not claiming to have originated these standards, purports to know them through and through and to care for them scrupulously? Certainly this sort of gesture, my own, in other words, this questioning of philosophy's very own honor and integrity, is no ordinary presumption, and may be considered, at least in some quarters, rather indecent and not so far removed from an act of vengeance or a flight of fancy which takes the whole tradition, the whole series of brilliant philosophical efforts, to be something less than itself, something less than calling into question philosophy's honor and integrity. I mentioned the need at the beginning of this exercise to risk a few infelicities in order to all the better catch sight of them. And I suggested that it should not be assumed beforehand that they have nothing to do with the honor and integrity of philosophy. Since this way of proceeding is far removed from the way philosophy itself proceeds, it is evident that I find something wrong with the way philosophy proceeds. Less evident than this side of my way of proceeding, however, is no doubt another side, which is that anything that may be considered wrong with the way I proceed is considered justified by me in order that I may justifiably proceed against what I consider to be wrong. Thus I can safely say that, if it is a presumption on my part not to assume that philosophy's honor is inclusive of its integrity, this integrity which unfortunately I have not identified, but let me now call it philosophy's will to be honest and complete, to be completely honest, then I think it is a presumption whose worth more than makes up for whatever indecency, vengefulness, or egotism may be counted against it. But I think I have gone as far as I can now in abusing the generous moment of those who have been taking in and tolerating my point of view. And, of course, the fact that they must not tolerate it rests well with me, for if I were not to meet with their resistance, if I were not given the opportunity to think them wrong but also right in their resistance, and, no less importantly, if I were not given the opportunity to think them more wrong than right in their resistance, it would be as if I had never had a point of view. And, similarly, if philosophy proper were never seriously confronted with what it considers to be improper, if it were not forced to recognize what was proper in this impropriety even while not recognizing it in the main, it would never have the sense of itself as being the proper and, just as importantly, justified as the proper. The question, honor and integrity in philosophy, are they possible? Is the title of the satire which I did not write. Yet I do not deny that it haunts this exercise, and it may well be that all that is called philosophical skepticism is marked by a certain mockery and self-mockery. But why should this be a problem for philosophy if truth is its mission, and if, in the final analysis, it can never be certain why it set off on it? To be sure, there are all sorts of practical reasons which no doubt stretch further than the eye can see. But if this is all there is, if philosophy were not marked by a deeper seriousness which involves in some way or other this more skeptical or satirical look at itself, and which in turn involves a more penetrating and, indeed, more hurtful look at itself, it would be wholly established in the business of truth and pure only in its attempt at settling contradictions rather than trying to be pure even in its contradictoriness.